Welcome to Försvar and this seminar titled Sweden, NATO and Nuclear Deterrence. My name is Pasi Ukri and I'm the Program Manager for Security Policy here at Försvar and will be moderating today's seminar. A warm welcome to all of you who are with us here in the venue and those of you following us online. With us today we have an eminent cast of speakers who will discuss one of the more prominent issues that we've been discussed both long before and after Sweden's membership into NATO, namely nuclear policy. We will start this seminar in just a moment by listening to Jim Stokes, NATO Director for Nuclear Policy. Director Stokes will give us an overview of NATO's nuclear policy. After the Director, we will discuss Sweden more concretely, and I'm glad to have Torbjörn Sahlén, Deputy Chief of Director for Strategic Plans and Policy at the Swedish Armed Forces with us, and Rydqvist, who's the Deputy Director for the Department of Security Policy and International Relations at the Swedish Ministry of Defense. After Torbjörn and John, we will make a broader global outlook and listen to Ian Anthony, who's a researcher at the Department for Security Policy at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, and Erik Melander, who's a professor at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. They will focus on the development of deterrence and deployment and the progress of disarmament. The seminar will end with reflections from a panel consisting of Josefin Lind, who's the Secretary General of the Swedish Physicians Against Nuclear Weapons, Anders Lindenberg, the political editor of Aftonbladet, and Linda Janek, the editorial writer at Expressen. With that presentation, I welcome Director Stokes up and open up for his remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm really happy to be back in Stockholm. The first time I visited was in July of last year when I was here with my family. And for me, in this position now, working for NATO, there's a special connection with Stockholm because this is actually where I found out that I was going to get this position with NATO. And so coming into this in November of last year and knowing that Sweden was going to join the alliance at some point, there's a really special connection, I think, with Sweden and the issues we're working on. So I'm very happy today to be here talking with you about some of these things. I have a briefing I'm going to provide that's going to go into some details about some of the things that we consider when we're talking about NATO nuclear deterrence. I'll talk a little bit about Russia and some of its nuclear capabilities and doctrine, and then I'll wrap up with some of the things we're working on as we look towards the future. So to start off, let's talk a little bit about nuclear deterrence. This is what we refer to as our nuclear deterrence equation. We try to keep the math fairly simple because deterrence can be somewhat complicated at times. At its core, deterrence is really about how do you affect the thinking or the mindset of a potential adversary so that it doesn't take an action that we don't want it to take. And that can be very complicated and difficult to do because sometimes we don't always have good insight into how others are thinking about our deterrence. But we try to focus on how we can improve in three different areas that collectively we think bolsters our deterrence. So first, we need to have credible and militarily effective capabilities supported by the resolve or the political will to utilize those capabilities if needed. And then we need to have an effective way to be able to communicate both our capabilities and our resolve. And that communication is obviously focused from a deterrence perspective on a potential adversary. But as I'll go into later in the presentation, we're also communicating to a variety of different audiences. And how an adversary perceives all three of these factors really kind of determines the success of our deterrence. So at NATO, we have a number of different public statements that have been published. Each year we have a communique that follows the summit. In 2022, we produce our strategic concept. And the allies come together and work very closely to craft language that then is agreed across all now 32 allies, where we put out different public statements and to include about our NATO nuclear forces and our deterrence policies. And just to highlight a few of these here, first, declaratory policy is in quotes because NATO does not actually have a declaratory policy because we're an alliance of 32 nations and several of them are nuclear powers. We don't have a declaratory policy the same way that the United States and the United Kingdom do, but we do collectively come to agreement about some of our key principles and how we think about nuclear deterrence. And to iterate a few of the points that we are often saying publicly, when we think about our nuclear forces and nuclear deterrence, the fundamental purpose is to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. Preserve peace in the sense that it's the absence of war. We want to be able to prevent any sort of nuclear coercion against the alliance, and then deter aggression or any sort of attack against the alliance. We have strategic nuclear forces that are provided by several allies, namely the United States, the United Kingdom, and also France, although in a somewhat different capacity. Those truly are the supreme guarantee of allied security. But we've also focused on how we can continue to make the investments needed to ensure that all of our nuclear capabilities are safe, secure, effective, and credible. When we think about nuclear weapons, we do think about them as being absolutely unique, and any employment of nuclear weapons against NATO would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. We don't see them as being substitutable by any sort of conventional weapons, and need to be very clear in that for any potential adversary to not misunderstand or mistake how we think about that if nuclear weapons were ever used against the alliance. And that even if that does happen, if the security of one of our members is threatened, that we have the capabilities and the resolve to impose costs against an adversary that would outweigh any sort of potential benefits they might derive from trying to achieve their objectives by using or threatening to use nuclear weapons against the alliance. An important point that we have is political control for any aspect of NATO nuclear deterrence is maintained at all times, and it is held by the political authorities alone. So we don't have any authorities that are delegated down to SACEUR or to others within the military for anything regarding our NATO nuclear deterrence capabilities. And so that ranges from a relative peacetime environment, so whether it's the defense ministers meeting to make decisions about some of the documents we produce from our committees, through a crisis or even a conflict situation. The political authorities are always maintaining control over every aspect of NATO's nuclear deterrence. And we think that really helps to demonstrate the unity within the alliance we have at a political level, and also maintaining good control over our capabilities. And of course, we will continue to highlight that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. We see it as fundamental to the security of the alliance that we maintain those capabilities. So within NATO, to go into our sort of decision-making process, we have the Nuclear Planning Group, which is responsible for any decisions concerning NATO's nuclear deterrence policies or posture. It typically meets at the level of the defense ministers, and in fact just met at NATO headquarters last Friday, and had 31 different defense ministers attend. And it can also meet at the level of ambassadors if we need to do that. But typically it's meeting approximately once per year, the defense ministers convening in Brussels to make important decisions about our nuclear deterrence policies or posture or anything related to that. The Nuclear Planning Group was established back in 1966, so quite a long time ago, and it's been used as the main forum to discuss nuclear issues within the alliance. So it's separate from the North Atlantic Council, it's at a similar level. We have 31 allies that participate in the Nuclear Planning Group, to include Sweden, so for the first time just last week. France is the only ally that chooses to not participate in the Nuclear Planning Group, and it's maintained that policy for a long time. And we think that that's totally fine because we have, I think, good consultations with France and understand their views on nuclear deterrence. And I think some of the statements that President Macron has said and the ways that France contributes with its independent nuclear capabilities, it does contribute overall to the deterrence for the alliance. In essence, what we have are separate decision-making centers within the alliance. So both in Washington and London for the United States, the United Kingdom, also with France, and then collectively through the Nuclear Planning Group, we have various ways of consulting with each other on nuclear issues and thinking through how we can make certain decisions in a peacetime environment, or if we got into a crisis situation, how we would adapt to that situation and potentially being able to respond to it. Those separate decision-making centers with our three allied nuclear powers and then collectively in the Nuclear Planning Group, it can be complicated. To be honest, it can be a little bit complicated at times within headquarters. We do have 32 sovereign nations trying to make consensus decisions. But we think that this is a benefit. It was one that shows the strength of the alliance and the unity we have on these issues. But it also complicates the thinking of a potential adversary as well, in that they don't necessarily know how we might respond to a certain situation, or how each of the allied nuclear powers could respond separately. And hence that ambiguity, if you will, maintains a high threshold for an adversary to use nuclear weapons against the alliance. In terms of our capabilities, you can see here on the slide some of the current platforms that we use. So NATO nuclear deterrence, our nuclear forces are primarily based on what we call our dual capable aircraft. So you can see on the left side of the screen some of our current platforms, what we refer to as our legacy platforms. These are conventional fighter aircraft that have been modified and have allied air crews that are trained to be able to support a nuclear mission if they are ever authorized to do so. We are currently fit for purpose to be able to conduct that mission, and as we move forward in the future, we are becoming even more effective, if we need to be, by the transition to the F-35A fighter aircraft. Just earlier this month, the Netherlands announced that it's fully made that transition from its legacy F-16s to the F-35. This is a posture change we're undergoing here within Europe with some decisions made many years ago to look at how we can modernize our aircraft for this mission set. And then on the lower right-hand side of the screen, you can also see a B-61 U.S. nuclear weapon. This is a training asset, not an actual weapon, but the United States has positioned its nuclear weapons here within Europe since 1954 through a variety of different bilateral agreements it has with certain nations to host U.S. nuclear weapons, and then also different types of arrangements with other nations to provide those dual capable aircraft and train those air crews. Collectively, we call these nuclear sharing arrangements. It's perhaps not the best phrase because nothing's really being shared per se. The U.S. maintains absolute political control over its nuclear weapons at all times. What we have shared is that political responsibility, the military burden, even the financial cost, with a number of different allies that support NATO's nuclear deterrence mission. But that's not the only way that the allies support this. This is obviously the most visible representation, but we have a number of other allies that can also contribute conventional capabilities to be able to support our mission. And there's a variety of other ways that allies can participate in the mission, everything from hosting different types of events like our annual nuclear policy symposium, which we held in Skopje earlier this year, sharing of intelligence, different ways of sort of raising the nuclear IQ, if you will. And I think probably what's most important is participating in the policymaking process, the consultations we have within the alliance, and that decision-making process, which may seem like a fairly straightforward thing, but it's really important that we have as many allies as possible participating in that process so that their national views on these issues can be incorporated in, consulting among the allies, and then when we're making consensus decisions, it really does reflect the views of all 31 allies within the nuclear planning group. In terms of our resolve or our political will to act, there's a variety of different ways that we can demonstrate that. We do have our policy statements, such as our 2022 strategic concept, the communique that gets published after the summits, and other statements by NATO leaders as well as allied leaders about NATO nuclear deterrence. The NPG allies share that political responsibility, again, for all aspects of NATO nuclear deterrence, and we want to be able to highlight that these are consensus views on these issues. We also have exercises and other demonstrations of capability that can be used to not only showcase some of the capabilities we have, ensure our military forces are trained and well prepared for our mission, but there's also a deterrent effect that we have from this. So we have an annual flying exercise called Steadfast Noon that we hold every year at the same time. It's our nuclear flying exercise, and a variety of allies will participate in that mission so that we can actually demonstrate militarily effective capabilities. But we also see that broader participation in Steadfast Noon is a way to, again, show some of the unity on these issues, that it's a shared responsibility across the alliance. And then the third component that I talked about is effective communication. So it's vitally important that we are able to communicate both our resolve and our capabilities to a potential adversary. We think that at NATO, our unity really is our center of gravity. And so unified decisions that lead to unified action really shows that it's going to be difficult, if perhaps not impossible, to undermine that unity within the alliance, and that you really have 32 nations that are speaking with one voice on these issues. But we use strategic communications to go beyond just sort of deterrence of an adversary. There are a variety of other audiences we need to communicate with. So the opposite side of my mission, if you will, when we think about deterrence, we're thinking about that vis-a-vis a potential adversary, but we have the assurance part of it. We have almost 1 billion people that we protect within NATO, and we need to assure them, given the gravely altered security environment that we're in right now. I know when I do public speaking, I mean, there's often questions about potential nuclear weapons being used, conflict against NATO, what does this mean? And you can sense sometimes that there's some fear among our populations about the environment that we're in right now that we obviously did not want to be in, but this is the world that we're in right now. And so we need to also think about our messaging and how we can assure our allied populations, communicating with our allied leaders to discuss these issues so that we can demonstrate that we're taking the actions, being responsible and prudently, preparing for different contingencies or scenarios that might arise in the future. And then even more broadly than that, it's about being more transparent as much as we possibly can on some of these issues. There's a wider international community that we need to engage with, a variety of other countries that are interested in what NATO is doing and different policies of the allies. And we want to be as transparent as we can up to a certain point, in part so that we can avoid any sort of miscalculation by a potential adversary, but also misunderstanding by our publics. And so we are looking at how we can communicate that. We've done some work to communicate more about our annual flying exercise. And what we've seen through different ways of monitoring the information environment is that our messaging resonates. It even resonates within Russian state television, where they pick up on what NATO is reporting and see that usually as factual coverage. And so we think that this helps to reduce miscalculation and sort of shape the narrative that's out there. So now let's talk about Sweden's role within NATO's nuclear deterrence mission. So just a few months ago, obviously Sweden joined the alliance without any sort of reservations or caveats, and that decision was broadly supported here. And I would assume was a reflection of the security environment that we're in today. There are, as I said before, a variety of different ways that allies can contribute to NATO's nuclear mission. Again, my primary focus is how Sweden can be participating within the nuclear planning group and some of its subordinate committees. Very happy to report that Sweden has been an active part of that. It's been helping us to shape some of our policies even in the last few months and ensure that Sweden's voice is heard in these matters. And again, this is a way that, Sweden and the other allies can maintain that political control and ensure that it's a good representation of all views on these matters. And then there are other ways that Sweden may be able to participate in some of our exercises. We have headquarters level exercises as well, where we try to think through crisis decision making, having a good understanding of some of the security challenges that we're facing, and other ways that as Sweden is sort of thinking through how it can participate with NATO's nuclear mission, a variety of different ways that can be used to support that. So let's shift focus a little bit and talk about Russia and what it's been doing. Obviously, the transatlantic security environment deteriorated rapidly, especially in the last couple of years or even the last 10 years based on Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. It's not just the conventional conflict that we're looking at. There is a nuclear aspect to this with the threatening and irresponsible rhetoric that comes out of Russia, which is used to try to intimidate or coerce Ukraine, but also NATO and its allies. And we're also looking at Russian behavior. So there are dual capable missiles that are being used within its war against Ukraine. Russia has also been modernizing and diversifying and expanding its nuclear missile force for a number of years, which also undermines allied security. And as you can see here, not only a variety of different delivery systems, but the number of nuclear warheads that Russia has. And of course, some of those are strategic warheads that it maintains for traditional deterrence purposes. But then there are also a number of, quote, tactical or non-strategic nuclear warheads. And those, I think, are of particular concern to the alliance because those warheads mated with different delivery systems certainly present a threat here within Europe, and it's something we need to think about from a deterrence and defense perspective. Russia's been modernizing its capabilities for almost 20 years right now and has been thinking a lot about how it might potentially utilize those forces in a variety of different scenarios and how it can achieve its objectives. And in terms of Russia's nuclear doctrine, in 2020 it published its updated nuclear doctrine, and in that it focused on a variety of different ways that it would consider utilizing its nuclear weapons. So you can see them listed here: a ballistic missile launch, use of nuclear weapons against Russia, an attack on its governmental facilities, so where it does nuclear command and control, or if there is a conventional aggression that could threaten or jeopardize the Russian state. I think what's also somewhat worrisome is the way that it's talked about different regional war scenarios. So it could be a potential conflict that could involve NATO, which of course we're a defensive alliance. We're not going to be starting a war with Russia. But the fact that it's invested in different types of capabilities and considered some scenarios where it could use nuclear weapons perhaps early within a conflict. We don't know exactly when that would be, but that coupled with this aggressive nuclear rhetoric is something that's of concern. And so we need to monitor the situation very closely, ensure we have a good understanding of how the Russians are thinking about this, and look at what they're doing. To point out the fact that they've had several out-of-cycle nuclear exercises, which predated their invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022, is something that we need to note and keep watch of. And then we also keep track of Russian messaging or signaling from its exercises and other things that it's doing. We certainly will be watching their capabilities and their posture to see if there are any changes to that. One thing to note, of course, we've been watching the statements that have been coming out of Russia and Belarus in terms of whether Russia would potentially move weapons into Belarus. And without going into any details, we certainly look at that from both a political and a military perspective to make sure we understand these changes within the security environment. Russia has been saying a lot and doing a lot, and I think there's a number of different ways it's trying to, again, intimidate allied populations, to undermine our unity on these actions, and again, sowing fear within our allied populations. I don't necessarily know how effective some of that has been. I think one thing that's somewhat encouraging is we've been doing polling research at NATO for the last few years across all 32 nations, so including Sweden last year, even before it was an ally, to have a better understanding of how our allied populations are thinking through some of these issues. And early this year, for the first time, we released the results of that data from the last 3 years that we've collected. 2 nuclear-related questions. This one pertains to whether NATO should retain a nuclear weapons capability as long as other actors do. And we've consistently seen high public support that we should actually maintain those capabilities as long as other actors, and specifically Russia and China, do. And you can note that the data originally was started to be collected even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And then we've also seen consistently high support for trust in NATO to act responsibly as a nuclear actor or as a nuclear force. So this is an important part. We're an alliance of democracies. We are beholden to our publics. We need to be able to explain these issues and need to be able to maintain that public confidence in what we're doing here. So an important aspect of how we're trying to have a good understanding of how our publics are thinking about these issues. And then lastly, where are we going forward from here? So of course, we're going to continue to look at every way that we need to make any sort of adaptations to ensure our deterrence is credible and effective. We're going to continue to look at how we can strengthen our overall policies and planning and posture. We're looking at how we can be coherent between conventional defense and nuclear deterrence, how we can enhance our exercises to make them more realistic, whether they're field exercises or things we do at NATO headquarters, modernizing our NC3 capabilities. Importantly, looking at ways we can continue to reduce nuclear risks. That's primarily from an internal alliance perspective, if you will, but having a good understanding of how a potential adversary would consider using nuclear weapons, understanding our own policies and key principles, our procedures, understanding escalation dynamics, and again, trying to be transparent on some of these issues. And then lastly, there are some future challenges we're starting to consider. One is the implication of emerging and disruptive technologies and what those implications are for nuclear deterrence. And lastly, we are looking at China and its expansion of its nuclear warheads and what that sort of implication is not only for the Indo-Pacific region, but how that could potentially affect global security and other issues. And with that, I can turn it back over to you to see if we have time for any questions. And thanks again for inviting me here today.
Just one question. Secretary Stoltenberg just mentioned in an interview a few days ago that NATO is contemplating bringing more nuclear weapons into a state of operational readiness. Are we discussing more nuclear weapons at the bases we already have, or are we looking at expanding to other countries?
Yeah, good question. So let's correct the record on that, because it's quite unfortunate that that came out. So the interview that was done with the Telegraph, when you saw the article was published, it was really taken out of context. And so we were working hard actually in headquarters on Monday to try to correct the record. If you're able to look at the full transcript of what the Secretary General said in response to the question, it puts it in a better context. So the question was about the United States has said recently that it may consider at some point in time that it needs to adapt its overall capabilities and posture, which could potentially include an increase in the number of its strategic nuclear warheads. And the question pertained to, well, what is NATO thinking about that? And the Secretary General was very clear that, as I just said, we're looking at a variety of different ways to ensure that we have effective and credible nuclear deterrence. And then there was a reference to, we won't go into any details, but we should have consultations within the alliance, as we should. And we would expect the United States would come and talk with the allies about decisions it's making. But unfortunately, that quote was then taken out of context, and it was spun into make it sound like we're increasing the number of nuclear weapons or pulling missiles out of storage. We actually don't have any missiles. Those are nuclear gravity bombs. And so it was really blown out of proportion. We don't go into some of those details about weapons locations or numbers because that information is classified. And we need to keep some of those conversations within the alliance. But I can say that unfortunately led to a lot of spin and misinformation that was being promoted out there. That's absolutely not the case. What I can say, though, and I'm very proud of the fact, when the defense ministers met last week, the decision that was made was, one, looking at our core nuclear policy document, and they approved that. So after months of work with 31 allies in committee, we've finally produced a new policy document that reflects the current security environment. It focuses on our key principles for nuclear deterrence, how we exercise political control through our command and control procedures, and then political guidance for everything that revolves around nuclear deterrence. So our force management issues and planning and exercises and our capabilities. So those are the types of things that we were discussing within the NPG. And it's not quite the situation that the press was talking about. That was just inaccurate.
We got that cleared up. Thank you so much, Director.
Thanks.
And we'll head to our next part, which is Sweden as a part of NATO's nuclear deterrence. And I invite General Sahlén up to the stage, who is also taking office at NATO as the Deputy Director, Operations and Planning Division in January and becoming Sweden's first NATO General, as the media has entitled it. Is that a correct title, NATO General?
No, it's a fictitious title, I must admit. The title you read is the actual title.
Title. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this seminar on this important topic. Let me start by saying some words about where we come from when it comes to nuclear weapons. Ever since the Cold War, we have upheld competence regarding the effects of weapons of mass destruction and how to defend ourselves against those weapons. And this we have done within the armed forces, but also, for example, in the Swedish Defense Research Agency. Since 30 years, when we became a NATO partners to NATO. We have developed our partnership with NATO based on the Partnership for Peace program. And in the last 10 years, we have deepened the partnership even further on the basis of becoming an enhanced opportunity partner with NATO. So we have developed a very close relationship with NATO on a number of different areas. And once we handed in the application for NATO membership 2 years ago, we became an invitee, which gave us even more insight into NATO. However, the area of nuclear deterrence is an area which we haven't been included in before becoming a member. So we only have 3 months of history as members, so we are just at the beginning of building the relationship, learning how to understand how NATO use these kind of tools and what could be or should be the Swedish role in this. And furthermore, when it comes to being a new member, it takes normally several years to be fully included in all aspects of NATO, and that journey is really ongoing right now. So with this said, we are just at the beginning of a learning process to understand how now NATO deals with nuclear deterrence. And let me also say some words about the security situation. Jim also spoke about Russia. Russia poses the most significant threat to our common security. And Russia does also possess a large number of nuclear weapons. And if we look to the map, we can also see that Russia borders a number of EU countries, NATO countries in northeastern part of Europe. So this is the part of Europe where deterrence is really vital for our common security, I would say. I was asked to say something about Sweden's role in NATO nuclear policy, and as you can understand, it's really too early to give clear answers to that kind of questions. And of course, this kind of decision making will also be based on political decisions, and then the armed forces will do, of course, whatever task we are given. But what I can say is that we have entered into NATO with a readiness to contribute to all 3 of NATO core tasks, being firstly, the deterrence and defense, secondly, crisis prevention and management, and thirdly, the cooperative security. So this is, we are ready to move in and contribute to all these 3. And as you already know, NATO is a defensive alliance, and when it comes to deterrence, it has to be based on having a credible capability in combination with clear strategic messaging, making the opponent refrain from attacking an alliance or escalating a conflict. And as allies, we are part of the common deterrence and defense, and the credibility of the deterrence depend on the cohesion of the alliance. So a credible deterrence is built on an appropriate mix of nuclear assets, conventional assets, missile defense capabilities is part of it as well. And the deterrence is a core element of NATO's overall strategy to prevent conflict and war. So the overall goal is not to end up in a war. For Sweden, it is therefore important to learn how we can contribute to a credible deterrence and to avoid undermining the cohesion and thereby the deterrence. And when it comes to deterrence with purely conventional means, Sweden contributes by ensuring a strong Swedish total defense. And in addition to that, the armed forces have been tasked to plan for taking part in NATO's different deterrence and defense initiatives with conventional means. And that includes activities on land, for example, forward land forces in the Baltic states. It includes taking part in NATO's standing naval forces, and also to contribute to different kind of air policing activities within NATO. Whether we will have to adapt any of our current capabilities or future capabilities in order to contribute to the nuclear deterrence is also too early to say. However, as was said there, my understanding is that nuclear capabilities rely on support from conventional resources for enabling and facilitating their operations. For example, situational awareness, logistics, or whatever. Our current capabilities are being further developed based on the existing defense bill, and as you surely know, we are approaching the next defense bill by the end of this year, and we are moving in a direction where we adapt our capabilities to become even more NATO interoperable, of course. And now we need to increase our knowledge about nuclear deterrence in order to clarify how Sweden also could contribute to the credibility of the nuclear deterrence. And finally, I would like to add the importance of working both with ensuring a credible deterrence and at the same time make efforts in line with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that concludes my briefing. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General. And of course, as you said, or as I understood it, Swedish deterrence is now NATO deterrence. NATO deterrence is now Swedish deterrence. Of course, you will soon, I'll still use it, you'll soon be our first NATO general. You will soon be heading down to Brussels. Is there anything you could tell us about your work, or what is it that you're going to do down in Brussels?
I will enter into a position at the International Military Staff, which is one of the two parts in NATO headquarters in Brussels. And the military staff supports the military committee and the different military working groups. And I will be the deputy of the division dealing with the operations and planning. So that's the task I will perform. Yeah.
Thank you so much, General, for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
And we'll now leave the military side and we'll allow to welcome John Rydqvist up, who's the Deputy Director for the Department of Security Policy and International Relations at the Swedish Ministry of Defense. We'll talk more about the non-military part, but how is Sweden actually working with nuclear deterrence, with the nuclear planning group, both in the Ministry of Defense, and of course, I'm guessing the Foreign Ministry as well have these questions on their table. So I'll leave it to you, John.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'll probably end up echoing a lot of what Jim and Torbjörn have said. But any which way, nuclear deterrence, of course, is a topic which is closely observed only by a very few number of security experts after we abandoned our national nuclear program in the late 1960s. And so a collective and nuanced understanding of nuclear deterrence strategy and issues that had to do with that sort of withered away. And so we haven't dealt with these issues for a very, very long time. And as a new member of NATO, of course, Sweden is in the very, very early stages of forming our role, our political role, within the alliance, including its deterrence and defense policy and posture. And because we haven't dealt with deterrence issues for a long time, most of us, this is especially true for the nuclear realm. So thus, from a policy perspective, this is an area which we have to carefully consider and, through time, develop our policy. The gravity of the current security situation, of course, as has been said, and the irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and behavior by Russia is a key backdrop when we continue developing our policy. The complexity of the nuclear deterrence domain means policy will be and will have to be formed in a step-by-step manner, in a thorough and responsible way. Okay, so I'll now take the opportunity to raise some key Swedish considerations on deterrence policy, where we are now, how we're thinking about it. And at the outset, I'll make some fundamental points of departure we have when we work on these issues, and then I'll highlight some key questions that are before us. So some points of departure. Sweden, of course, has declared it stands fully behind NATO's policies, including the alliance nuclear policy and deterrence posture. The government has also made very clear that Sweden will contribute to the alliance deterrence and defense measures, including nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence, of course, being the ultimate security guarantee for allies and the alliance. It's important, I think, to underline that NATO, like Jim said, but I want to underline that, is a defensive alliance. Its deterrence posture and our deterrence posture now is tailored to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. At the same time, nuclear challenges to the alliance are growing. Russia, China, and for that matter, North Korea, continue to put increasing emphasis on nuclear weapons as a tool of coercion and deterrence. That makes the world a more dangerous place for us, and we need to think about that. NATO, at last year's summit in Vilnius, reiterated that the alliance will continue to adapt its nuclear deterrent capability to remain credible and effective in the current security situation, which mirrors what I said before. Allied contributions to the nuclear deterrent are central. We are in an alliance, and we have to do this together. And that includes conventional support to the nuclear missions. For deterrence to work, and Jim talked about this, to be credible and to be effective in preventing nuclear use and promoting peace, a combination of political unity, resolve, and capabilities are essential. Communicating the alliance policies and postures in clear ways to the public, which we are doing now, and potential adversaries in ways that avoid misunderstanding is a key component. This is a principle true for conventional deterrence as well as nuclear deterrence. Strategic stability, predictability, and reducing the risk of armed conflict are also key to NATO's objectives because it helps promote peace. The alliance seeks to create a security environment where we can have a world without nuclear weapons, and that's stated in several documents. This highlights, we think, the critical link between NATO's deterrence and defense efforts on the one hand, and arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation on the other. Two policy instruments that are complementary to Allied and the alliance security. As an ally, Sweden will continue to clearly contribute and pursue arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation policies in ways that underline, for example, the fundamental importance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, to finish off here, given that those outlines and where we are, what are key questions we take with us now as we move ahead and form policy? Well, one is how can Sweden contribute to increased security for the alliance writ large, of course, because nuclear deterrence and preventing nuclear war is best done by preventing war. We see this clearly in Ukraine, where Ukraine is a war with a nuclear element because Russia makes these threats. So we're looking at the whole deterrence and defense as one part. But in that will also be how do we contribute to nuclear deterrence. What role can we play? And finally, with Russia pursuing a reckless nuclear rhetoric and China undertaking what seems to be a fast buildup of its nuclear arsenal without transparency about its weapons, opacity about its doctrinal developments, and no willingness to engage in arms control discussions, how can Sweden, as a member of NATO, best contribute with our knowledge and our perspectives on these countries and the security situation writ large? So these are some of the questions we're now looking at as we pursue policy evolution, and I'll leave it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I understood that you talked about Swedish nuclear policy step by step. We're formulating it now. We heard from the general that it's quite early still. If I may ask, how does the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs share these responsibilities? Have you created new forums? Do we have the expertise in nuclear deterrence? What's changed after our membership when we have to make decisions in these questions?
I mean, as for the armed forces, for us, it's been a key to develop knowledge, and we do that. I mean, we've tried to do that in the government offices collectively as well, and it's really, really important for us in this domain where there's so much policy that we do that jointly. So I would say the ministries work very closely together, trying to build that knowledge and understand how we should pursue policy formulation together, because no one ministry can do or handle this very complex topic. So that has been, I think, a key to us when we started off thinking about these issues, and once we came into the alliance, started understanding and being integrated into this domain, the nuclear domain, how to do that. So that would be my. And I think we're doing that in a very, very good and rigid way.
Yeah. Sweden has quite a history of discussing non-proliferation, nuclear weapons, and of course, as we understand, nuclear planning group, everything that deals with nuclear deterrence, quite a lot of secrecy. How much transparency can Swedish citizens expect going forward when we're not only talking about non-proliferation, but actually talking about nuclear deterrence?
I think this is one thing we're doing, and that's very much the government has been adamant that we try to be as transparent as possible. I remember I was here a year ago. We had a British delegation. Already at that time, non-allied, we had held an open seminar discussing these issues. We invite Jim, we invite others to talk about this. And also, I think the government has been very clear. They have stated clearly where Swedish policy is, from the defense minister, the foreign minister, the prime minister, and that's been part of public sort of signaling and public diplomacy throughout the NATO accession period. Of course, like Jim said, some of the things we won't be able to talk about because they are classified and shouldn't be in the public realm. But it's important because we are democracies and because we're an alliance formed by democracies to try to sort of be as transparent as possible. And I think this is one example of this.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we'll change our block and we'll talk more about deterrence, deployment, and disarmament. And I welcome Ian Anthony up as our first speaker in this block, who's a researcher at the Department for Security Policy at the Swedish Defense Research Agency. And I invite you to share your thoughts with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. So what I wanted to do now was to begin perhaps just by trying to put what's happening today in a bit of perspective. That after the end of the Cold War, really the 1990s, we saw about 3 decades of countries working hard to push the role of nuclear weapons into the background and reduce their prominence in international security discussion. And the question we have now, for the reasons that have been mentioned, the deteriorating security environment, is whether we've come to a break point, where in fact now the role of nuclear weapons will once again come to be emphasized. So what is it exactly that we want to prevent? Of course it is, as has been mentioned, nuclear use. And deterrence, defense, and arms control have traditionally worked in tandem to try and bring about that reduction of the risk of nuclear use. And we're in a situation now today where, as we're going to hear, I think, a bit later, the prospects for arms control as we've traditionally understood it we're not optimistic about the possibilities. So basically I want to talk about 3 points of concern, things which really we have to think about very carefully. Now the first one, which has already been touched on, is what you might call the normalization in some countries of the use of nuclear weapons. The 3 nuclear-armed countries inside NATO have adhered very firmly to the proposition that a nuclear war can't be won and should never be fought, and that's something which obviously Sweden has also strongly supported in the context of pushing nuclear weapons into the background. But is it true elsewhere? We've already heard from the earlier presentations about the developments in Russia, not just the modernization of forces, but also the increasing use of nuclear signaling and rhetoric as a coercive tool. And of course, Mr. Putin is fond of saying that if you believe that a fight is inevitable, you should strike first and strike as hard as you can. So the possibility of nuclear use is something which is very much becoming part of the internal security discourse in Russia. We don't know how Russia will rebuild its armed forces after Ukraine, but one possibility certainly is that the role of nuclear weapons and associated missiles and delivery systems will become more prominent. But as has also been mentioned, this is not only an issue for Russia. 2022, North Korea modified its nuclear doctrine and is also emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons in a situation where the conventional asymmetry with South Korea is becoming more and more pronounced. And even in the Middle East, we have the statements by the IAEA of great concern about Iran's nuclear fuel cycle and developments in it, but also a discussion inside Iran about nuclear doctrine and whether it's necessary to take this final step of actually developing nuclear weapons. So the normalization of nuclear use is something which I think is one of the key issues that we have to address. A second key development, really, I would say, is the pace of China's nuclear weapons program. There's a rapid expansion of numbers, but also an expansion in the diversity of Chinese nuclear systems, including in strategic weapons, closely linked, of course, to the deteriorating relations with the United States, but also in terms of developing regional capabilities which would be more suitable for use in a conflict scenario. We can see to a certain extent what it is that China is doing, but trying to understand why they're doing it is more difficult when the colleagues in China refuse to engage in a dialogue about exactly what their intent is. China is one of the countries which has had at least a declaratory policy of not being the first to use nuclear weapons. It's somewhat unusual. Most nuclear-armed states have a policy of nuclear ambiguity, not excluding the first use. The question is whether, given the development of China's nuclear forces, this no first use policy can really be sustained, or whether we're actually headed to a situation where China too will contemplate the first use of nuclear weapons. A third key development, which I think we have to have a focus on because of the importance of the United States to the alliance, is the internal US discussion about the role of nuclear weapons. There is a comprehensive modernization planned of US nuclear forces. All 3 legs of the nuclear triad are being modernized, as well as the nuclear weapons complex, which would give the US the possibility, if necessary, to produce additional weapons. But we can see that just implementing this program of record is very, very challenging for the United States. There's a technical challenge associated with modernizing command and control in the digital age, which leads to cost increases. There's a challenge of finding a workforce that's capable of building the systems that are planned. And of course, there are competing needs. The nuclear forces are just one part of the US military capability. Because China is doing what it's doing, that is seen in the United States as the driving factor behind an internal discussion about whether the existing planned nuclear forces are sufficient or whether they need to be adapted, which could mean more nuclear weapons, it could mean better nuclear weapons, It could mean different nuclear weapons, or it could mean more, better, and different nuclear weapons. This is the conversation that's going on. But I think from a European point of view, one part of the arsenal is particularly important, and that is the bomber force. We saw in the past that the B-2 program was cut back very severely. The numbers which were anticipated were never built. And the future projection for the B-21 bomber, the replacement system, is a very, very important element in both deterrence signaling and also in capability. So the extent to which the US is going to modify its nuclear programs is something that we have to pay close attention to. So in view of the time, I would just make a few final observations, really. Of course, a significant number of countries in the world actually put their faith in nuclear deterrence as a key element in their defense policy. Within that discussion in those countries, there's a tendency to downplay the risk of nuclear use. And we see this sometimes when we have statements by Mr. Putin that the response will be, well, it's a bluff, there's no evidence that this will happen. The risk of use can't be quantified, but it's real. And there's no point in pretending that it isn't. So we have to engage with this discussion, think about what are the serious problems and how do we deal with them, rather than engaging in a kind of wishful thinking that perhaps the problem isn't as big as we thought it was. A second final observation, the regional security dynamics in Europe, but also in the Middle East and in Asia, continue to deteriorate. So there is a risk that we move from a situation where non-proliferation of nuclear weapons has been the norm to a situation where more and more countries begin to see nuclear weapons as an important element in their defense policy, given this normalization of nuclear weapons in the international discourse. So I think these are key problems that we have to keep a focus on and not pretend that they don't exist, but try to understand them and develop effective countermeasures.
Thank you so much, Ian. You were talking about normalization of nuclear weapons, pace of China, internal US discussion. And what I get from that is we're looking towards the US in Europe and in Asia, countering two perhaps nuclear adversaries. You were talking normalization of nuclear weapons, Russia talking about Ukraine, China reaching 1,000 nuclear warheads perhaps by 2030. Are we seeing, do you think it's more American nuclear weapons in Europe, or is it a bigger British and a bigger responsibility for the British and friends to create deterrence? What's your thoughts?
Well, I'm a researcher, I'm not a policy person, so this is not something that I will decide. But certainly the role of the two European nuclear-armed states is something which I think is becoming more of a discussion. I think there's a general understanding that whatever happens in November, and whoever is sitting in the White House in February, European countries have to assume more responsibility for their own security. Now, exactly what that means in terms of decisions, we shall see. But the fact that we have two nuclear-armed states in Europe, I think, has to be a part of that conversation. What can we do to contribute more to effective deterrence at a European level in one way or another?
Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And we'll move on and talk perhaps more non-proliferation and disarmament. And Erik Melander is a professor at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research in Uppsala. A warm welcome, Erik.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Well, the prospects for nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament are undeniably very bleak. And we may be at the cusps of a new nuclear arms race that will result in numbers of strategic nuclear arms higher than the present limits under the New START treaty that expires in 2026. And one by one, the components of the arms control regime that were put in place during the Cold War and during its aftermath, they are abandoned. The non-proliferation treaty regime, which is the most important remaining pillar, has been rather successful in preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. However, we are currently balancing on a knife edge. If Ukraine is defeated by Russia, there is a risk that several other countries may shift toward acquiring nuclear weapons. Similarly, if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, there is a risk of a regional domino effect, and so on. Over the decades, one may say that an ambition to further nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament has been a cornerstone in Swedish foreign policy. But there's also been a tendency to balance more radical aspirations to promote disarmament with more realpolitik concerns related to security cooperation. And with Sweden now a NATO member, it is natural that there is more of a discussion and debate about what role Sweden can assume in the future in this regard. So while it is important to note that the current outlook for disarmament and arms control is grim, I think it is also crucial to recall that significant arms control agreements were achieved even during the height of the Cold War, a period marked by intense rivalry and mutual suspicion. So this historical perspective is valuable in the current context as it prompts us to consider what lessons can possibly be learned from the Cold War and perhaps also other similar historical episodes, such as the interwar naval treaties. And it's also worth noting that despite the current challenges, both the United States and Russia have expressed their intent to continue adhering to some key risk reduction and arms control measures. This includes the Ballistic Missile Launch Notification Agreement and the provisions for pre-launch notifications in the Hague Code of Conduct Against Ballistic Missile Proliferation. Similarly, Russia has withdrawn ratification from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, but it remains a signatory to the treaty and has expressed its intention to continue adhering to the nuclear testing moratorium and operating the stations within the International Monitoring System, IMS, on Russian territory. Mentioning these examples may seem as grasping at straws. But I think it is important to note that while some of the major powers do weaken and undermine the arms control regime for instrumental reasons, perhaps mainly for signaling, to intimidate, to convey resolve, there are areas where their self-interests overlap, and agreement is possible. This overlap in interests create the foundation on which negotiations and agreements can potentially be built, even in today's tense geopolitical climate. Of course, mutual overlapping self-interest cannot be trusted to hold, even if agreements are reached and signed and ratified and so on. Actors in international relations cannot afford to be naive, and therefore verifying compliance with whatever has been agreed is of utmost importance. So it is therefore necessary to develop new technological means for verification, as well as to develop more knowledge and understanding about the political limitations that these technical means encounter in terms of lacking political will and secrecy and so on. Another aspect that I think deserves stressing in this context is that agreements and practices that ultimately fail and are abandoned can nevertheless be worthwhile. Because while they are in effect, they contribute to stability, they may contribute to building a minimum level of trust, and they save money. And when parties renege on or withdraw from agreements, that failure in itself is a clear indication about where things are moving, hence an important warning signal. So what can Sweden do? As a NATO member, Sweden can continue to promote non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament within the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as was mentioned. And this has been Sweden's firm line, as I understand it, at least since Sweden decided not to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons 5 years ago. And according to NATO's strategic concept, as was mentioned, this framework, the NPT framework, is the framework within which the alliance will promote nuclear non-proliferation and implement various arms control and risk reduction measures, aiming to ultimately create a security environment conducive to a world without nuclear weapons. Sounds very distant, but nevertheless. So Sweden expressed an ambition in this regard in 2019 with the Stockholm Initiative, and continues to work along those lines. I think Sweden can also contribute by encouraging long-term research and developing new evidence-based knowledge that may become useful, not today, but when the political circumstances change, which may be in a month or maybe in a decade. Yeah, and I think maybe I should wrap up there. Thanks.
Yeah. I think you answered it a bit. Sweden should continue working with non-proliferation, or it's a possibility that we can still do that. But have you noticed any shift as a professor before and after NATO, or is it the same? We're part of NATO, but it's still non-proliferation. We still have the same force behind what we say and what we do in different forums.
Well, I think it's a gradual shift, perhaps, because Sweden is more coordinating with partners and allies, and shifting away from the kind of rhetorics and policies that were more associated with the ban treaty, and now more working within the non-proliferation treaty. I think it's a gradual change. It didn't happen 3 months ago, but it began many years ago.
Yeah, so same goal, but different tools, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Erik. That's all the time we have.
Thank you.
And I'll invite the final panel up on stage, which is Josefin Lind, who's the Secretary General for the Swedish Physicians Against Nuclear Weapons, Anders Lindberg, Political Editor-in-Chief at Aftonbladet, and Linda Janek, who's an editorial writer at Expressen. Just do some miking. So, welcome. Before you give your reflections on what we just heard, yesterday the Swedish Parliament voted for the Defense Cooperation Agreement with the United States. It's been one of the main issues in the debate has been nuclear weapons. What's your view on how the debate has been about nuclear weapons and the DCA? Are you happy with the DCA, with the explanations that have been given?
Should I answer that? Yeah. I think I'm not very satisfied with that, ladies and gentlemen. I think it was something that Jim Stokes said here in the beginning. Actually, you didn't say it, but it was written on your PowerPoint, that Sweden needs to communicate with the public that Sweden has a strategic concept now, including nuclear arms. And I think that for the Swedish public, that is something people haven't really heard from the political leadership. It's not really part of important documents like the Foreign Declaration or the Government Declaration. And I think that it completely failed the debate on the Defense Cooperation Agreement. I think that the reason it was so much misunderstandings and falsehoods in the debate, also in the parliamentary debate, is that you didn't have this discussion from the beginning. And I think that a large proportion of the Swedish population, as a result of this failure in communication, now thinks that we have decided to let in nuclear arms in 17 military bases run by the US in Sweden. A large proportion think that. And even if it's kind of a fairy tale, it is a problem that a large proportion think that. And I think that the reason you haven't really had this debate has resulted in so many untruths that are becoming truth in the debate. So that is quite severe criticism, I would say, about how this spring have unfolded.
Josephine, your comment about the DCA?
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, for our part, I think the failure is the failure of the government to reject nuclear weapons, that it hasn't been able to communicate, as you said, that they communicate that there's no reason to have nuclear weapons in Sweden at this point, but we would of course wanted to have seen that there's no will or intention to get nuclear weapons in Sweden in all times, both in peace and war times. And I think that's something also the opposition has failed to get to pressure the government to explicitly explain to the public, what does this mean? Does it mean that we can get nuclear weapons in Sweden in war times, and under what circumstances? And I think the parliament has really failed to make a clear stance against that and show that there should be a national law banning this.
Linda?
I, for once, agree with Anders. I think there is a lack of understanding in Sweden about deterrence and what does that actually mean, both among politicians and among the public. And I think there are some misunderstandings. I think many Swedes have this view that as long as Sweden doesn't have any nuclear weapons itself or on Swedish soil, we won't be a target for a nuclear attack. But as you all here know, there is no such gentleman's agreement or in the Russian doctrine that says that you can only use nuclear weapons against a nuclear power. So I think this is a very new discussion in Sweden, and in many ways it's based on falsehoods and misconceptions.
Yeah. So we'll try to leave the DCA, we'll see if it comes back, but if we start with you, Anders, your reflections about deterrence, deployment, disarmament, what you just heard.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that it was a very interesting discussion. I was also part of this seminar with the British government were here earlier, and we had this debate. One interesting thing with that debate was that it wasn't online. It was broadcasted online, but it wasn't still online after the debate. And I think that says something about the way we have debates about these kind of issues, that it wasn't really there anymore after it was sort of broadcast. And that has been very much the case, I would say, in this debate, that we have had debates in closed rooms, in different circles of experts, in different circles with very much interested people, but it hasn't really been something that the public have discussed. And I think that the key problem here is going to the core of this new strategic concept and the word deterrence. We are unused with the word deterrence. We don't use that. We don't think of ourselves as something deterring Russia, because we are quite smaller than Russia. If you look at a map, you see that our idea is not deterrence. We have had different words. We have like a threshold capability. We should increase the pains on Russia so much so they won't interfere. But of course, Russia is bigger. So this concept of deterrence, that we should be part of something deterring Russian actions and in a way preventing Russia from doing things, I think that is a novel concept for people. And because it's a novel concept, it's very hard to just internalize this kind of debates. So I think that the key is the concept from the beginning of deterrence. I don't think Sweden is used to this. And I think that if we should change that, because we need to change it now, we need to start with actually openly and transparently discuss what are nuclear arms? What is the function of nuclear arms? In what kind of situation are they used? Because I don't think, as you said, I don't think there is any doubt that Russia could very well use a first strike policy with nuclear arms. They have exercised this against European capitals, and I would say that that is a concept that the Swedish public need to know. You need to be clear that Russia could be the first one using nuclear arms without provocation, without us doing anything. And I don't think that is clear for people. I don't think you understand the Russian concept in the debate.
Let's move on.
Yeah, so I had one more point, but I can take it later.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Now, I think we need to go back to the basics. If nuclear weapons was detonated over the parliament, there would be 90,000 people would die immediately, and 250,000 people would be in immediate need of advanced medical care. And at the same time, the whole city would be in ruins and on fire, and there's no way we could ever respond to this catastrophe. And I think we need to know these questions, as you said. It hasn't been in the public for many years, and we don't really understand. And I appreciate what Ian Anthony said. We need to calculate the risks, and as Swedes, we need to move away from this. We can't join this nuclear deterrence, because if it works 99.9% of the times, but it fails once, there's a catastrophe that we can't handle. And there's no way to build up that capacity to handle this. So Sweden should join the majority of states in the world not relying its security on nuclear deterrence, because the stakes are too high. And by adhering to nuclear deterrence, we are contributing to keep nuclear weapons as something desirable, something that's acceptable and knowledgeable to have and to use. So we need to firmly reject this, and Sweden should be an area of relaxation, and that would keep us much safer. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Linda, your reflections on the speakers?
I think it was a very interesting seminar, and of course, I think Anders has also said, I agree with him, but I would like to maybe reflect a bit on what the Swedish physicians against nuclear weapons said here, because I don't agree with that analysis that Sweden would be safer without the nuclear umbrella. I think we are safer now as a member of NATO and as a part of the nuclear deterrence. In Sweden, it has been a lot of discussion about American nuclear weapons and very little discussion about the Russian nuclear weapons that are actually aimed at us. We know that Russia has left the New START treaty. We know that they have been placing nuclear weapons in Belarus. They have Iskander in Kaliningrad. All of this makes is a threat against Sweden and against NATO and our allies. I still think that Sweden should be, just as Erik Melander said, we should still be working towards disarmament, non-proliferation. Sweden has been and is still an important voice, but we need to realize that it's Russia and China who's going to set the pace for any arms control and disarmament. And we can't afford to be naive.
Yeah, thank you. If we move on to a question, let's start with Dennis again. How do you view the relationship between being a member of NATO and non-proliferation? We heard from experts, but of course you have a political opinion. Do you think it's going to be possible to continue non-proliferation?
I think it will be possible to continue this discussion. I don't think it will be possible to be part of the UN Convention, for example, but I think it will be possible to continue discussion, but it needs to be continued from a position of strength. It needs to be continued from the same kind of position we had during the Cold War, when actually the two parties could make agreements and actually reduce the risk, reduce the number of warheads, and reduce ultimately the risk of a nuclear conflict. And I think that we should continue this policy. I don't think the Swedish government should change its policy in any way about this. But I think that we need to be, as I think the professor were, quite realistic in the possibilities of doing this. Russia and China and North Korea and Iran has absolutely no interest in decreasing risk, absolutely no reason to decrease anything like looking like, I would say, what they would perceive as weakness. They are actively engaged in a number of conflicts. They will be engaged in more conflicts. We could very well see a Chinese attack on Taiwan, etc. So there is no interest from that side. But that said, I think that we should continue our policy of reducing tensions, reducing nuclear arms, and not the least, the NPT treaty, to keep up the non-proliferation treaty, so that we won't have the situation that were mentioned here with a kind of renewed nuclear race. And I think that's possible.
Yeah. Josephine, is it possible to be for nuclear proliferation in NATO?
Non-proliferation.
For non-proliferation.
Yeah, I agree in some parts. Definitely, it's. I mean, a lot of all NATO members are part of the NPT, obviously. So that's a work that we can and should still do. Although I think joining a nuclear umbrella alliance and relying on deterrence makes it more difficult to reject and to press the nuclear weapon states to disarm. It's harder for Sweden to say, we want nuclear deterrence for our safety, but you should disarm. That's something that will be more difficult than that's something that Sweden has done in the past. So that kind of policy will be difficult, I think. But the pressure on the states on the NPT is obviously something Sweden can join. And I think we must also, in the NPT, think about how to treat Russia. How they use nuclear weapons to invade another country and keep states away. So how can we treat Russia within the non-proliferation treaty? Can they be seen as a responsible nuclear weapon states in the treaty? And that's something that Sweden needs to also think about in partnership with others.
Yeah. Linda?
Well, I think we are all in a basic agreement that Sweden should still support the NPT and do what we can for to have non-proliferation and disarmament. But it's, of course, I mean, the reality is that countries without nuclear weapons can talk, but it's the nuclear powers who have the power to decide if there is going to be disarmament or not.
Yeah. So a final question before we finish this seminar. What do you think Sweden should focus on in the nuclear planning group or perhaps in NATO when it comes to nuclear deterrence?
I unfortunately think we need to focus on Russia. And I think that we need to focus on our vicinity on the Baltic Sea, how to, of course, reduce tensions, but also how will this deterrence actually be played out in reality? Because we have now seen many plans. We have seen the government wants to be, we will be part in Latvia, we will be part in the Baltic Air Police, and we will be part, not the least, with the Marine Forces on the Baltic Sea. But we need to have a kind of cohesive concept of what is the kind of baseline in the Baltic Sea in north of Europe. And of course that baseline is deterrence. And so that's number one. Number two is the Arctic. Because what Sweden is basically, with the place that we have now, with the future expansion of both China and Russia in the Arctic, we see the Arctic as more or less a kind of a great power competition area. And we are perfectly placed in the middle of that, which is maybe not the best place to be. But we need to really assess the risks, assess the possibilities of that geographical location that we have. So that is the two things I think Sweden should contribute in the planning group.
Yeah. Josephine?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Sweden should do is join the other Nordic countries to have clearer policy against nuclear weapons in the territories, or as in Finland, a national law. And that, I think, Sweden could bring into NATO to be a responsible partner, to be a country of relaxation in the Baltics, along with the Nordic states, to make sure that there are, make it safer and clear to Russia that there are no nuclear weapons in this area. And that I think is an important part for Sweden to do in NATO in the coming period.
Yeah.
I think since conventional capabilities are important to support the nuclear deterrence of NATO, I think Sweden might have a role to play there. Sweden has a large air force, for example. But I also think that there is homework for the Swedish government to do, which is to educate its public and maybe politicians as well, and also to comfort them and explain what nuclear deterrence means, and especially for Sweden.
Thank you all so much for participating, and thank you to all our speakers before, for you who are here in the venue listening in, for you who is online. That was the last comment of this seminar. Thank you for watching.